In this lecture, we're going to cover the endocrine system, chapter 18. So the first thing we're going to do is compare the endocrine system to the nervous system. We are going to compare our endocrine glands to exocrine glands. We're going to talk a little bit about how hormones work and how they're secreted. And then we're going to go through all of the organs and hormones of the endocrine system. So our nervous system, if you remember from A&P1, works with neurotransmitters that are released locally and activate that synapse or activate that muscle to do something. And that action is usually only going to happen within it for a few seconds. So it's only going to be stimulated for a few milliseconds. It's going to have a brief action, and then that response is going to be over. The neuron will reset and be ready to receive another signal. Our endocrine system is more of a long-term, long-distance system. So hormones are able to be released from one organ of the body and travel through the bloodstream to a distant, different site of the body and activate or inhibit effects in that tissue. So these hormones are going to have a longer duration of action. They're going to work for minutes, hours, sometimes days. And again, going to travel farther distances throughout the body. And here we're going to use hormones and not neurotransmitters. All right, so what's the difference between endocrine and exocrine? So we looked at our exocrine glands in the digestive system a lot. We said that they secreted their product into ducts, and then those ducts emptied right onto the surface of the body somewhere. Whether it was outside, the inside, the lumen of the digestive tract, those glands were secreting right on into ducts and then right onto the surface of the skin or something like that. So for example, our sweat glands, our salivary glands, those gastric glands and pits that we saw in the stomach. The endocrine glands are going to secrete their product into interstitial fluid. So they're going to secrete their product into the interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid that's surrounding all of our cells. The hormones then are going to diffuse from that interstitial fluid into our bloodstream, and they're going to be able to travel through the bloodstream to wherever they need to go, and again, cause effects at those distant tissues. So we are going to look at the endocrine glands today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how hormones work. So how do these hormones work? How do these chemicals that are released from our endocrine gland go to a different area and work? So hormones are going to bind receptors. Again, receptors are specific proteins that only cells that have an effect by that hormone will have a receptor to. We're not really going to waste room on our cells that don't have any effect if that hormone binds to it. So these receptors are just these little special proteins that are going to allow for that hormone to bind and then cause some kind of action inside of that cell. So depending on how much hormone is present, we can upregulate or downregulate these receptors. So we can upregulate these receptors if we need to increase the amount, our sensitivity to our hormone, so we don't have a lot of it. We can downregulate these receptors, meaning not have as many on the surface when we have lots of hormone present in excess. These allow us to have the correct amount of stimulation from the endocrine system. We don't want to have too much or too little because, again, they affect cellular processes in other cells. So if we have too much or too little of one hormone, we're going to be affecting the actions of other cells. So these hormones, again, they bind their receptors, and we're going to be able to manipulate how many receptors are present on the surface of each cell if we need more or less action by that hormone. Endocrine hormones are called circulating hormones. So again, they're going to be able to affect cells that are far from the site of release because they enter the bloodstream from the interstitial fluid. So here in this picture, you can see this action. So here's our endocrine cell releasing its hormone into this interstitial fluid, so into this white space around our cell. So around all your body cells, right, there's going to be a little bit of space and a little bit of fluid, and that is our interstitial fluid. Anything that's in that fluid then is going to be picked up by those capillaries, like we looked at in chapter 21 with the blood vessels, right? We said the capillaries were really skinny. They were only one cell thick. So we were going to have things be able to diffuse right across them. So this hormone is going to be able to diffuse into our blood capillary and it's going to circulate around until it binds these receptors on those target cells. And again, only the cells that are going to have an effect by that hormone will have a receptor for it on their surface. So other than circulating hormones, endocrine hormones can act in two other ways. They can act locally. One type of signaling is called paracrine, and the other is autocrine. So paracrine is just where the endocrine hormone is going to activate its neighbor cell. Autocrine means that hormone is going to activate itself. So that's going to activate, it's going to release that hormone and it's going to bind to a receptor on that same cell. So what do our hormones look like? Well, we have two different classes of hormones. We have lipid soluble and we have water soluble. And again, this is just going to be based on their chemistry because as we saw in pretty much everything else, structure is related to function. So these lipid soluble hormones are going to be these large, like hydrophobic, big structures. And we're going to see that these are going to be a lot of our bigger hormones, testosterone, estrogen, things like that. All of these larger hormone molecules that are going to have lots of effects in the body. When we look at testosterone and estrogen in the reproductive chapter, you'll see all of the tissues that these hormones have effects on. So to get these hormones to all of those tissues, because they're lipid soluble, they can't just be transported alone in the blood. They have to be bound to a transport protein. So with all of these lipid soluble hormones, we will see transport proteins if these hormones are circulating in our bloodstream. These hormones are also really easily to be replaced because we can give them orally. So we can give you a medication orally, like by a pill, like estrogen-based birth control pills or something like that. And it's no big deal to be able to have your patient take it and just go into their bloodstream and be able to be absorbed, right? Water-soluble hormones are going to be a little bit different. So our water-soluble hormones, you can see just by looking at the picture, they look a little bit more of a simpler structure, to be honest with you, right? We see maybe one ring, but not many. A lot of these are just a lot of carbon-oxygen, carbon-hydrogen bonds. Very basic kind of protein structure. So these water-soluble hormones, a lot of them are proteins. So these are going to be able to be transported freely in the blood, which is great. We don't need a carrier. We don't need a transport protein. But they're not going to be able to be replaced orally because of our digestive enzymes. You guys looked at how many different things in the body digest protein, right? We looked at hydrochloric acid. We looked at pepsin. We looked at a bunch of enzymes from the pancreatic juice and some enzymes on the brush border. All of those were peptidases, right? Or proteases. They were going to break down our proteins. So if we give your patient these medications orally, these medications will be easily broken down and these hormones would be inactivated. So we are usually going to give these by injection. So these will be injected under the skin so we are able to absorb these more, or they're going to be directed directly into the bloodstream, right? We give epinephrine that way. We give a couple other hormones that way. We give a couple other hormones, again, underneath the skin to slow their absorption. It's going to depend on the hormone and what we're using it for. And that's what we're going to go through next is all the different types of hormones. So a little bit more in detail about how these hormones work. So lipid-soluble hormones versus water-soluble hormones are going to have different mechanisms of action because they have different structures. So the lipid-soluble hormones are able to diffuse directly through the plasma membrane. They can go right through that lipid-soluble plasma membrane, go right into the nucleus, bind right to the DNA, and activate gene transcription. So these can have direct effects on our gene expression by directly affecting DNA. We affect DNA, we produce a new mRNA, we make new proteins, and we're going to stimulate or inhibit our cell's activity. So again, lipid-soluble hormones can diffuse right through the plasma membrane and bind to a receptor right onto the DNA. Our water-soluble hormones aren't going to be able to do that. They're water-soluble, so they can't cross that big lipid bilayer, that big phospholipid bilayer that is our plasma membrane. So these guys have to bind to a cell surface receptor. So that's what you see here. You see this little water-soluble hormone binding to the cell surface receptor, and it's going to activate this little blue jelly bean here called G protein. G protein is one of our first steps in this signaling pathway. It is signaling to the inside of the cell that this molecule has binds the receptor on the outside of the cell. So this hormone is going to bind the receptor on the outside of the cell. It's going to activate G protein. G protein is going to activate adenylyl cyclase, and it's going to convert ATP into cyclic AMP. So again, not that important, but this is how this pathway works. And you can see that we're going to have multiple proteins working for this process to be able to occur. So this water-soluble hormone is going to bind the receptor on the outside of your cell, and it's going to cause this huge downstream signaling pathway. So activate adenylyl cyclase, activate cyclic AMP, activate a bunch of protein kinases, and cause lots of phosphorylation. So basically, they're just going to either activate or inactivate these proteins, and it's going to cause some change in the cell this way. So again, we're not going to just make new proteins by gene transcription or stop making proteins. We are going to actually modify or kind of turn this protein product on or off. So that is the difference between our water-soluble hormone and our lipid-soluble hormone. Lipid-soluble hormones bind the receptor inside of the cell, inside of the nucleus on the DNA. The water-soluble hormones are going to bind a cell surface receptor and cause a downstream signaling pathway to be activated. Okay, so hormones can work together or oppose each other. So we have a couple different types of interactions that if we have two of the similar hormones present in that area, we can have an increased effect sometimes. So a permissive effect is the action of a hormone that requires a second hormone stimulus to be fully active. So epinephrine and thyroid hormone can both increase lipolysis, which is fat breakdown, and they can do these individually. But if we have epinephrine present while the thyroid hormone's present, it's going to allow this effect to fully occur. So again, it's a permissive effect. The first hormone really needs that second one to be fully effective. Yes, it's an active hormone. Yes, it can still do some things, but it's not going to really be able to do its job completely without having that second stimulus. Hormones that have synergistic effects of each other work together, and our actions together are stronger than their actions apart. So epinephrine and glucagon work together and really increase blood glucose levels. So they can both do this individually, but again, if they work together, they're going to be a lot stronger. An antagonistic effect is where two hormones have opposite effects of each other. So their actions are going to oppose one another. And that is, for example, insulin and glucagon. As insulin insulin decreases blood glucose and glucagon increases it. So they have opposite or antagonistic effects. So how are our hormones secreted? So most hormone secretion is regulated very highly. It's usually done in bursts, so you don't have this like long continuous release of a hormone, so your hormone levels don't get too elevated. So we really just want to have these short bursts, again, so we don't have over or under secretion. This is well regulated by signals from our nervous system, chemical changes in our bloodstream, and other hormones. Most of this control is done by negative feedback inhibition loops, so we will look at a couple of those as well. So again, while we're looking through our hormones, you want to think about what is causing this hormone to be released, what is causing it to be inhibited. Okay, so our first organ that we are going to talk about is kind of the big control center for our endocrine hormones. This is in the hypothalamus. So you guys talked about the hypothalamus when you looked at the nervous system. You saw that it is the tissue that underlies our third ventricle. So we have this kind of funny W shape right here. This is the hypothalamus. It lies directly under the thalamus and is just this physical tissue that is underlying the third ventricle where that cerebrospinal fluid would be. So This hypothalamus is going to have a couple different types of these neuroendocrine or neurosecretory cells. So they are going to be neurons that are going to stimulate a secretion or produce a secretory product themselves. So the anterior or the hypothalamus is going to regulate the secretion of the anterior pituitary gland. Our anterior pituitary gland releases a lot of hormones that are going to have a lot of different effects in our body. And those hormones are going to be regulated by these releasing and inhibiting hormones of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to secrete 5 releasing hormones or stimulating hormones. So growth hormone releasing hormone, that's going to trigger growth hormone release. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, we'll see increases thyroid stimulating hormone release. Corticotropin releasing hormone, which is going to increase release of something called ACTH. Prolactin, which is going to cause release of breast milk, and prolactin releasing hormone, which is going to cause release of prolactin, which will stimulate breast milk production. And then our gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to stimulate our gonadotropes, which are these cells inside of our anterior pituitary. We are also going to have 2 inhibiting hormones. One is going to be growth inhibiting hormone, and dopamine, which is our prolactin inhibiting hormone. So the hypothalamic hormones reach our anterior pituitary by this hypophyseal portal system. So hypophyseal is just another way to say hypophyseal is just another way to say pituitary, not hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypophysis or hypophyseal is related to the pituitary. So we want these hormones to be able to get to the anterior pituitary without becoming inactivated or even, their secretions being decreased by the liver. So again, you're going to see another portal system in this case, this hepatic, or like we saw with the hepatic portal system. We're going to see this hypophyseal portal system. So this is going to allow these hormones to filter directly from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary. So we don't lose anything getting filtered by the liver. We just send them right where they need to go. So this is just like that hepatic portal system that we looked at. This is the hypophyseal portal system. Again, just bringing that blood to the hypothalamus, or bringing that blood to the anterior pituitary from the hypothalamus without being inactivated. So that's how the anterior pituitary gets its hormones. The posterior pituitary is going to get its hormones directly from the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary doesn't actually have cells that would be producing hormones. Like you see these trophic hormone secreting cells in our anterior pituitary. So when we looked at the histology, we actually saw cells. So the posterior pituitary doesn't have any cells that actually produce hormone itself. It just contains the axons that have that secrete the hormones from the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary, you're just going to see those axons. They're going to look like strings. And they are going to actually release their hormones in the posterior pituitary, but they are still coming from the hypothalamus. So we will see our antidiuretic hormone and our oxytocin released from these specific nuclei, which if you remember are just collections of cell bodies of neurons in the central nervous system. And it's going to send those axons into the posterior pituitary and release those hormones directly into that posterior pituitary. So let's look at these hormones a little bit more in detail. So again, here's kind of a summary slide of everything, and then we're going to go through all of these hormones individually. So here's everything on one summary slide, and now I'm going to skip through and we'll talk about each one in a little bit more detail. So growth hormone is one of our first hormones that we think about when we think about the anterior pituitary, because it does a lot of stuff. It is responsible for growth in many tissues. So we are going to see that growth hormone actually stimulates growth and metabolism in separate ways. And it's going to stimulate growth indirectly via the action of these molecules called IGFs, insulin-like growth factors, or somatomedins, So somatomedins is the old school name for it. We call these insulin-like growth factors now. So IGFs get released from the liver and they circulate throughout the body. They're going to be able to bind in any kind of tissue that needs to grow at that time. So IGFs can also be released from the bone, muscle, and cartilage the tissues themselves to also further increase growth. So when we release growth hormone, from the anterior pituitary, it's going to go to the liver, it's going to go to the bone, cartilage, and muscle, and it's going to cause those tissues to release insulin-like growth factors. And these are the actual factors that are going to stimulate growth. So in this way, growth hormone stimulates growth indirectly. Growth hormone also stimulates metabolism. It's going to regulate our metabolism directly. It's going to be able to directly go to the adipose tissue and increase lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. This is going to increase the fatty acids that are circulating in the bloodstream and are available to make ATP. Growing requires a lot of energy, as if you've ever seen a kiddo who is growing, you know. They are very tired and cranky, and you're like, I swear by the end of this week, they're a quarter inch taller than they were. Because it was just like the worst week ever. You're like, my kid's normally totally great, and this entire week has been a nightmare. And it's usually because they're growing. It takes a lot of energy. It makes them really cranky. It messes with their hormone secretions. It messes with their sleep schedule. So that's why when kids are in those growth stages, you can usually tell because it throws them off a little bit. And so we have to increase all this energy into the bloodstream because we're trying to increase all this growth in these tissues. So we break down fat, but growth hormone can also decrease carbohydrate uptake by our body cells. So it's basically blocking our body cells from uptaking glucose so it's available for all of your neurons. So the neurons are going to be the ones that kind of have to control everything, right? They're going to be the ones that are responsible for controlling all of this growth and everything else that's going on at the same time. So your body is going to save them that blood glucose because it knows that there's extra fatty acids in the blood that the other cells of the body can use because it just put them there. So growth hormone is going to work to increase available energy in the bloodstream, and then indirectly stimulate growth in the tissues via those insulin-like growth factors or IGFs. Growth hormone is released in bursts every few hours. Again, this is going to be stimulated by that growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Growth hormone releasing hormone levels will increase with hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar, decreased fatty acids in the blood, and increased amino acids in the blood. It's also going to be activated by sympathetic nervous system activity, deep sleep. So like I said, your kiddo is going to be sleeping more, or if they're not, they're going to be super grumpy. Testosterone, estrogen, and thyroid hormone. So multiple other hormones are going to stimulate the activity of this growth hormone, right? Testosterone and estrogen, those levels are going to increase as we go through puberty, and we know everything grows in puberty, right? And we get taller, you kind of finish getting your height, right? Your feet kind of finish growing, right? Right after you started puberty, you're kind of when you were finishing it, now you can still wear all those shoes, right? You're still been that same shoe size since about that point. So that's why when these hormones increase, we're going to increase growth hormone. Because right at the start of our testosterone and estrogen levels kind of getting to their normal post-puberty levels for adulthood, that's going to be our last push of growth right there. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the reproductive system as well. We are going to inhibit growth hormone release by growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone is released from the hypothalamus and is going to inhibit growth hormone secretion in response to high blood sugar, right? Hyperglycemia. Well, if our blood sugar is already high, we don't need to make it any higher. Increased fatty acids in the bloodstream or decreased amino acids in the bloodstream. It's also going to be inhibited by obesity because the body knows that it's already at the size it needs to be. But this can also be bad in kiddos with obesity because they're round but they didn't get taller, right? We're decreasing growth hormone levels if they have that increased body weight. So we're going to be decreasing the size of their bones and muscles as well. So again, just another kind of hormone signaling thing that can be an issue in kiddos. Sometimes these pathways don't always work right. And so you will be noticing some symptoms in your patients, and they'll send them to an endocrinologist, and they'll go, oh, they had a hormone deficiency this whole time. That was our only problem. Boom, we give them a little bit of that growth hormone. Now they're normal body height again. They're normal growth curve, right? All of that for their age. So again, the endocrinologists are going to be able to look at all those hormones and see which one isn't working correctly. Because maybe they're not growing. It might not be growth hormone. It might be testosterone or estrogen or thyroid hormone. That's the issue because of those permissive and synergistic effects. So again, this is just one piece of our puzzle. So that also increasing or inhibiting our growth hormone is going to be our age, right? That makes sense. Tissues start growing as much as we age. We have lots of growth from childhood to puberty. Puberty, we kind of finish up most of it. And then we'll just have normal kind of maintenance growth, right? Everything else, we've kind of stopped growing in height and bone size and that kind of stuff. We will also have increasing levels of growth hormone or the insulin-like growth factors working via negative feedback regulation to inhibit that growth hormone. So again, or that growth hormone secretion and the growth hormone releasing hormone secretion. So these guys will negative feedback at both of those points. Because we do not want to have excess secretion of any of our hormones. But if we have excess secretion of our growth hormones, we can lead to a diabetogenic effect. So this would just be like a mild increase in growth hormone secretion. We could eventually cause diabetes in your patient. So that could be a problem and not a very common cause of diabetes, right? Normally we have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which we'll talk about. But just know that there are other things that are not just directly insulin related that can affect blood sugar and cause diabetes or diabetes-like symptoms. So what if we have this growth hormone completely unregulated and lots of extra secretion? Well, if this happens in kiddos, we get giantism. So their bones and muscles don't get that signal to stop growing, and they end up being like 7 feet tall, very broad-shouldered. We don't see this too much anymore because of those growth curves. Again, we can't say that there's a normal range we don't see this giantism too much anymore because of the growth curves. Now, again, there's everyone's normal body size or good body range for their body to work optimally is going to be different. But we have kind of a curve that we can watch kiddos progress on to make sure that they're getting the right height and not getting too tall too quickly, because we know it could be a hormonal problem if they do. And usually we're able to go in and fix that or adjust with medications or something like that. Again, you guys will learn all that cool pathology and treatment and stuff in your nursing classes. But usually we're able to go in and fix this now. At least edit the problem slightly. So we don't have that extreme giantism as we used to. But again, if you look at some pictures of this, you Google growth hormone giantism. You see some really interesting pictures from back in the day before we really knew what was causing this. We do see this increased in adults often enough, which is interesting, I think, because I would think it would be more increased, kind of an unregulated thing in kids where everything's starting to develop and trying to get into the right lane, basically. But we see this be increased in adults a lot, and it causes acromegaly. And this is where their bones will start to get bigger. So they will look the exact same for, 20, 30, 40 years even. Exact same face. You've probably seen, like, my grandma has looked the exact same since I remember. The only thing that changes is her hair, and she gets that dyed. So, like, some people look very similar for years of their life. And then they get this weird increase in growth hormone. For some reason, something triggers this secretion to be off. And all their bones start to grow again. Their hands will get bigger. They'll tell you their shoes didn't fit. I've had the same pair of shoes. Like my grandma's had the same pair of church dress shoes for like 20 years probably because she loves them. And she only wears them on Sunday. And so, they'll tell you, well, my shoes don't fit. I've worn the same pair of shoes for years and now it doesn't fit. Or I have gloves. I notice my gloves don't fit. Or they're working and they wear gloves in their job. Lots of people wear gloves at work and they'll tell you, my gloves at work, I've been putting my fingers through them or they don't fit. And you have kind of these weird things that people will come in and say to you. I think my face looks different in pictures or something like that. And that's what really starts it. A lot of people, will notice this before even you can as a healthcare provider. When you come in and you look at them, you won't notice that Mrs. Jones looks any different, but she does because she looks in the mirror every day. So really interesting presentations of increased hormones. So that's what we're going to talk about each hormone as we go through, what we would see if that signaling would be off. So acromegalia in adults, if growth hormone is increased and their bones start to get bigger. If we have decreased secretion of growth hormone, opposite side of this, we're going to have a type of dwarfism. So the whole stature will be smaller. Head, arms, legs, all of it. And that's what we see in different forms of dwarfism. We'll see different features be smaller than others. Sometimes it's just the limbs. Sometimes it's the torso. And again, just different causes of dwarfism. In growth hormone dwarfism, we see everything just slightly smaller because there just wasn't enough stimulation when those tissues were growing. All right. So the next hormone released by our anterior pituitary gland is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So TSH is a very common hormone. I would definitely say know this whole pathway in detail. Very, very common to have patients with hyper and hypothyroidism. So not enough T3 and T4. And a lot of it is due to problems with this hormone, this TSH. So our TRH, our thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, is going to stimulate TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone release, from the anterior pituitary. This TSH is going to go to the thyroid gland, and it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. So T3 and T4 are our active forms of our thyroid hormone, and we'll look at that in a lot more detail when we look at the thyroid gland as a whole in a few slides. So this T3 and T4 is really what's going to help regulate the secretion of TSH and TRH. Again, this is a really good example of our negative feedback loop. If we have increased or normal levels of T3 and T4, we're going to inhibit the TSH and TRH release because we have enough in the bloodstream. So that would be our negative feedback regulation. If we don't have enough T3 and T4, again, we will turn this off and we would stimulate this pathway, TRH to TSH to T3 and T4. So TSH, again, is just a thyroid stimulating hormone. It is going to go to the thyroid gland and make the thyroid gland produce T3 and T4. All right. FSH and LH are two of our reproductive hormones that are released from our anterior pituitary. So we will talk about these guys a lot more in the reproductive system. But FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and it stimulates sperm and egg production. So we'll see that we actually call that a follicle, and it will actually stimulate sperm to be produced and eggs to be kind of activated each month. We'll see how that works in the reproductive system. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, is going to stimulate testosterone production and estrogen production. And it's also going to help with ovulation. So we see that releasing of that egg every month is due to our LH. FSH and LH work together to stimulate estrogen production, and they are both released by the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, and it's going to trigger FSH and LH release again in response to the testosterone and estrogen signaling in the reproductive system. So they are inhibited by estrogen and testosterone via negative feedback inhibition. So we will see again how these work in detail in the reproductive chapter. We're also going to talk about this hormone more in the reproductive chapter. But prolactin works permissively with lots of your other hormones to stimulate milk production. So it is normally inhibited by dopamine. So dopamine we talked about as a neurotransmitter. It also works as a hormone in the bloodstream. So dopamine is normally going to inhibit prolactin production. It is just normally you just don't make milk, right? So dopamine is going to decrease then when a baby is born, and it's going to stimulate milk to be produced. Dopamine will also decrease each month before menstruation, and so we get breast tenderness. So you will see some patients come in and report this to you when you're discussing menstruation and their like monthly cycle, if they have any kind of symptoms like that. breast tenderness is very common and normal right before your period every month. So you can reassure your patients that this is just due to normal hormonal signaling. So we see, again, there's a prolactin releasing hormone that will help stimulate this, but really it's nursing infants. Really just, the body just knows that that baby's there and needs that food. And this is why we just have that milk kind of production once the baby's born, right? It starts to be produced during development. So we will see that when we look at pregnancy and development and that stuff at the end of this, at the end of our class, I guess. That's our last chapter in the book. So we will look at that and how all of this signaling occurs. We don't currently know what this does in men. They make it, they have it. It can cause lactation in males if it's inappropriately secreted. A lot of medications, this will be a weird side effect of medications. And they constantly are bringing out new medications and then recalling them or something because of this symptom. So I guarantee you will see it. You will see this happen from medication and from other things in males as well. It's not as uncommon as it sounds. If it is elevated in men, it's not always going to cause lactation. They usually have to have some other problem in that signaling pathway. But it can cause erectile dysfunction. So also a very common problem that you will see in the hospital or in your office that your patients will come in and say that they need some help with, right? We have a lot of medications and things for that. They might just have a prolactin issue. So we will look at that as well. So prolactin, kind of an interesting hormone. You'd think, oh, I'm only going to deal with this OB in babies, but you really do see it in other parts of medicine. If we have this increased in females when you're not pregnant or nursing, you can still have inappropriate lactation. Again, galactorrhea is what this is called, inappropriate lactation. And you will see this in males or females with inappropriate prolactin signaling. All right, so our next hormone that we're going to look at is our ACTH. Our ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, controls the production of cortisol and other glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. So we're going to talk about cortisol when we get to the adrenal gland. So to stimulate corticotropin releasing hormone and increase cortisol production, to stimulate ACTH and increase cortisol production, we have a signal from corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, from the hypothalamus. CRH stimulates ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which will stimulate cortisol production from the adrenal cortex. CRH is stimulated by stress, low blood glucose, physical trauma like an accident or surgery, and signaling molecules called interleukins. So interleukin 1 is a specific cell signaling molecule that can activate this hormone to be released. Cortisol is also inhibited by negative feedback regulation. So normal or elevated levels of cortisol in the bloodstream will feedback and negatively inhibit ACTH and CRH release from the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So ACTH is going to increase our production of cortisol in times of stress and injury. So melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, is our last hormone from the anterior pituitary that we're going to talk about. We still really don't know what this does. We see a lot of cell receptors in the brain, so we think that it might have something to do with brain development. We know that if we give MSH or molecules that look like MSH to people, we can darken their skin pigmentation. So it does stimulate melanocytes to produce melanin, if you remember back to the skin chapter. And we can darken skin pigment using this hormone, but other than that, we're not really sure what it does. It is stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone, so that's stress hormone again, and it is inhibited by dopamine. So again, really interesting signaling pathway. I'm sure that there will be some kind of research that comes out within your careers, hopefully. We can figure out what this does. So here's a summary of those anterior pituitary hormones, what they do, where they're released from, their target tissues. All right, on to the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, we said, has two hormones. It does not make those hormones. It just stores and releases those hormones from the hypothalamus. So those neurosecretory cells of the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei are going to release oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin, we're going to talk about when we get to the reproductive system as well. It is going to stimulate labor contractions and milk letdown. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is released from the supraoptic nuclei, and it stimulates water reabsorption in the kidneys. So diuretics mean to increase urination. Antidiuretics are going to conserve water. And here's a summary of our posterior pituitary hormones. Again, we will talk about these in more detail when we get to the reproductive system and urinary system. All right, moving right on down to the thyroid. The thyroid gland is that anterior kind of butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. We saw that it sits right below that thyroid cartilage and on top of the trachea. It has two main types of cells: follicular cells, which we are now calling T thyrocytes, and parafollicular cells, which your book is calling C thyrocytes. So the follicular cells are going to be the cells that make up the follicle. So if you remember, we looked at those pink swimming pools. They're full of colloid, and the edges of those pools were made up of follicular cells. Those follicular cells are actually the cells that are going to produce the T3 and T4, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine. So 3-iodine and 4-iodine molecules attached to make this hormone, which we'll look at more on the next page. The thyroid follicle can store this hormone for up to 100 days in these colloid pools. So if your patient is going to have a thyroid hormone deficiency, a lot of times we're not going to see it right away as soon as those cells stop working, because we're going to have a backup supply for at least 100 days. So our parafollicular cells then are going to be the cells that are next to those follicles. Parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin that helps with our calcium balance. So we'll look at that when we look at the parathyroid gland in just a few slides. So our thyroid hormone is going to be produced again and stored by those follicular cells and then stored in those colloid pools. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, we have to have good levels of dietary iodine. Iodine is going to absolutely be critical to produce accurate amounts of thyroid hormone. If we see decreased iodine levels, we're going to see decreased production of thyroid hormones, and we'll talk about that. So the first step is to get the iodine out of the bloodstream and trap it into the follicular cell. We are then going to transport it and a molecule of what we call thyroglobulin into the lumen of the pool, into the colloid. So as we put those into the pool, they're going to mix together, and the iodine is going to bind to the tyrosine molecule on the thyroglobulin. So we are going to see these tyrosine molecules, or iodine molecules, bind to the tyrosine of the thyroglobulin. The thyroglobulin is then going to be just hanging out. So this iodinated tyrosine on this globulin chains are going to just be hanging out in this colloid pool. If we have one iodine on each tyrosine, we call this a monoiodotyrosine. So one iodine on a tyrosine. If there are two iodines on this tyrosine, we call it a diiodotyrosine, or a DIT molecule. So this is what's in our colloid pool. We are going to couple these MITs and DITs together to make active T3 and T4. So if we have one monoiodotyrosine and two DIT, and one DIT, diiodotyrosine, we're going to end up with three iodines, and that's going to be our T3, our triiodothyronine. If we put two of those DITs together, we're going to have 4 iodine, and we're going to end up with tetraiodothyronine. So this is our T3 and our T4. This is going to be hanging out in the colloid pool. We will bring some of this material back into the follicular cell and break it down and cut it apart into just that active T3 and T4. Those T3 and T4 molecules are going to be passed into the bloodstream, and they're going to bind to a molecule called thyroid binding globulin. Thyroxine binding globulin, or thyroid binding globulin, is going to carry our thyroid hormone through the blood to all the tissues that need it. So for this pathway to work, iodine levels are going to be really crucial, and we're going to have good working organelles. You see that involved in this process, we have lots of things happening. We need our good rough endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi complex, lysosome. So we need these follicular cells to be fully functioning, and we need to have good dietary levels of iodine to be able to produce our thyroid hormones like normal. So what do these thyroid hormones do? Well, their main goal is going to be to increase basal metabolic rate, so increase metabolism. So this is going to increase all the things that let your cells get work done, right? All of the cells of your body getting the work that they're doing, growing, all of that stuff. All of those anabolic and catabolic reactions, we're going to increase the speed of them by increasing this amount of thyroid hormone present. So what is this going to do? Well, it's going to increase sodium potassium pumps in our cell membrane. We know to have action potentials happen and all of that stuff we talked about in nervous system and skeletal or in muscular system and that kind of stuff. We need ions to be in the right concentrations on either side of our cell membranes, right? Just for things to be able to happen correctly. So thyroid hormone is going to help put in some extra pumps to make sure we always have the available ions we need to balance on either side of the cell and to make these things be able to happen. It's going to increase the amount of enzymes. So we're going to be able to increase the amount of enzymes that are produced and used to help produce ATP via cellular respiration. It's also going to increase the number and the activity levels in our mitochondria because that's where we're making ATP. It's going to increase the use of energy. And we said when we are working and we're using ATP, we're going to increase heat production. That was kind of all we said about heat. When we increase the production and actions of ATP, the body's going to be doing more work and it's going to be increasing heat production. This helps maintain our body temperature. We're going to see that this helps enhance the activities of epinephrine and norepinephrine, those sympathetic emergency alert hormones. And we'll talk about those more today in the adrenal gland. But we're going to see that these hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, are going to increase heart rate, contractility, and blood pressure. So all of these things are going to be increased with thyroid hormone levels. We're going to see that this also regulates growth and development, and that normal levels are going to be crucial during fetal development. To develop our nervous system, it's going to help form synapses. It's going to help myelinate those neurons. It's going to make sure the dendrites are the right size that they are. It's going to grow the different dendrites and have the correct sensory receptors. It forms the skeletal system. It literally helps those ossification centers that we look back at way back in A&P1 and how those bones formed. They really form due to a lot of signaling by thyroid hormones. We're also going to have proteins be produced. We know we need a lot of proteins to make our bones strong and flexible. And it's going to also help our growth hormone and those insulin-like growth factors work in our bone tissue. So again, really crucial for bone development. We're also going to see decreased thyroid hormones. If we see decreased thyroid hormones during fetal development, we can see intellectual disability and decreased bone growth. So really want to make sure that those thyroid hormones are in normal levels during pregnancy. So how do we control all of this hormone secretion? We control our thyroid hormone secretion. Again, most of it is due to negative feedback inhibition. So those T3 and T4 levels in the bloodstream are going to feedback inhibit on the TRH and the TSH and inhibit their production. Increased ATP demand will also increase thyroid hormone production, right? If we need our metabolism increased, we can do that. So in the cold, right, to keep your body warm, we're going to increase thyroid hormone production. With hypoglycemia, because you don't have enough blood glucose or glucose in your bloodstream. At high altitudes and in pregnancy. So we will see these hormones elevated in conditions where we need more energy. All right, so that's what our thyroid hormone does. Lots of actions of the actual T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones. If you remember, they came from the follicular cells. So this hormone, calcitonin, is going to come from those parafollicular cells, the cells next to the follicle. These cells are going to release calcitonin, which is going to decrease blood calcium levels or tone down calcium levels. So they're going to work in balance with our parathyroid hormone, which is what we're going to look at next, to maintain our blood calcium. So calcitonin decreases blood calcium by inhibiting osteoclasts. So if you remember back to the skeletal system, we had osteoblasts, which were our bone builders, and we had osteoclasts, which were our bone degrading cells. So osteoclasts had those enzymes that degraded bone, and they released calcium into the bloodstream. Well, we want to stop doing that because we already have enough calcium in the bloodstream. So it is going to inhibit the action of the osteoclasts and increase the activity of the osteoblasts. So it's going to take some of that calcium out of the bloodstream and stick it into the bones. Again, this is going to be regulated by negative feedback inhibition based on how much calcium is in the bloodstream. Here's a nice summary of those thyroid hormones. And here we will talk about our parathyroid. So our parathyroid gland is going to be embedded in the back of the thyroid gland. So if you remember, it's just those four little kind of circular structures that are embedded in the back of the thyroid gland. So there are two types of cells in the parathyroid, the chief cells and the oxyphil cells. The chief cells make parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone, again, is going to increase blood calcium levels. Our oxyphil cells are going to do, we don't know yet. It's up in the air. We're not quite sure what our oxyphil cells do. So more to come on those through your career, I'm sure that I know they're also researching this because everyone is very curious. So there's not too many things that we don't know what they do in the body, but a lot of them do involve hormones, the things that we are still unsure of because these pathways are very complicated. Oh, there we go, calcium homeostasis. So here you can see the balance between that parathyroid hormone increasing blood calcium levels and that calcitonin decreasing blood calcium levels. So parathyroid hormone is going to do the opposite of calcitonin. It is going to increase those osteoclasts to work and secrete calcium into the bloodstream. It is going to increase reabsorption of calcium in the urinary tract and digestive tract. It's going to inhibit those osteoblasts from putting calcium into the bone. So here's a good picture of how these are balanced together. And if you look in your textbook, it will show you their negative feedback loops side by side. Okay, so moving right along to our adrenal glands. So our adrenal glands, again, are those small little triangle birthday party hats on top of the kidney. They are just these little glandular structures. They're not very big, but they have a lot to them. They are going to have that outer capsule, and then on the inside, they're going to have that cortex and the medulla. The cortex is going to have 3 layers. The outer layer closest to the capsule is going to be called the zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa is going to release our mineralocorticoids, or principally aldosterone. Our zona fasciculata is going to release our glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol. And our zona reticularis is going to release some androgens, mainly an androgen called DHEA that we will look at in a minute. We will also see the adrenal medulla, the innermost part of the adrenal gland, that releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. So again, here is a picture of that histology from lab. I would not ask you to identify each of these individual layers, but you could definitely do it. Just orient yourself to the capsule and the medulla. The adrenal medulla is going to be full of blood vessels, so you are going to see those vessels as these little circles. So again, zona glomerulosa under the capsule, fasciculata in the middle, and zona reticularis right on top of the adrenal medulla. So those mineralocorticoids, or principally aldosterone, are going to regulate our sodium and potassium ion concentration. This is going to be really important for maintaining and regulating blood pressure and blood volume. It's also going to help us excrete hydrogen ions in our urine and prevent acidosis, so help maintain a normal blood pH. We are going to talk about aldosterone more when we get to the renal chapter because it's really important. Its actions are in the kidney. So we will look more at that renal angiotensin aldosterone pathway when we get to the kidney. But we briefly touched on it in the blood chapter. It was either one of our cardiovascular chapters. We talked about it briefly. Here we'll say where it's released from, and then we'll really talk about the actions of it when we get to the urinary system. All right, how about that zona fasciculata? So zona fasciculata is going to release our glucocorticoids, principally cortisol. You see we have multiple types of glucocorticoids: hydrocortisone, corticosterone, cortisone. Again, just going to be milder forms of cortisol pretty much. So what does cortisol do? Well, cortisol increases protein breakdown. So it's going to increase the amount of amino acids that are available in the blood for you to make ATP from. It's also going to cause glucose formation, right, via gluconeogenesis from those amino acids that it just helped release into the bloodstream. It is going to help break down fats to release fatty acids into the blood, again, for gluconeogenesis. It is responsible for our resistance to stress. So increased blood glucose in the liver can make increased ATP and respond to stress. So we are going to see this hormone help us with our stress pathway. It's a pretty potent anti-inflammatory. So it's going to inhibit those white blood cells that produce inflammation. It will inhibit tissue repair, and it will slow wound healing. So this can be good for chronic inflammatory disorders where we would give a cortisol shot into the hip or something to decrease inflammation. And it's good. We can also give this as an oral steroid to decrease overall inflammation in lupus and arthritis, certain types of arthritis and things like that. But also can be an issue if this pathway gets overactivated, because we can have a decrease in immune response. Again, in high doses with cortisol, we can have decreased immune response. So this can make your patient be sicker than they normally should be because they don't have a good functioning immune system. So this can be bad, but we can also manipulate this for good and with our organ transplants. So we can give our patients cortisol in our organ transplants to help try to decrease that transplant rejection. Cortisol is regulated via negative feedback inhibition. And we see that increasing levels of glucocorticoid or cortisol production will inhibit that release of CRH in our hypothalamus and the ACTH in the anterior pituitary. Again, this can be increased with chronic stress. We will see increased corticotropin releasing hormone released and have elevated levels of cortisol, which you can see could have many negative effects because it decreases the immune system effects and stuff like that. All right, on to the zona reticularis. Zona reticularis secretes androgens, mainly DHEA, dihydroxyepiandrosterone. This is more of a milder androgen, so it's not nearly as strong as testosterone or anything like that. And it's going to be responsible for the secondary sex characteristics in males and females. So, hair growth, that kind of a thing. All of those secondary sex characteristics, deepening of the voice, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the reproductive chapter. Again, males kind of minor effects. Females, it is responsible for libido, and it's converted to estrogens. So it helps contribute to the amount of estrogen in your body. It is the only source of estrogen after menopause. So we will see that this is the only source of estrogen after menopause, and you will see a lot of times that this is responsible for some of the symptoms of menopause. Its regulation and secretion isn't really well understood. We just know that it is stimulated and released when ACTH levels are elevated. Okay, now into that adrenal medulla. So that was the outer adrenal cortex layers. Now we're into the inner adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, again, is part of the sympathetic nervous system. It gets that response from that emergency alert system in times of stress or exercise. And norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to be released from those chromatin cells in the adrenal medulla in response to those neurons firing from the sympathetic nervous system. This is going to increase our heart rate and contractility, increase blood pressure, increase blood flow to the brain and skeletal muscle. We said decrease blood flow to the skin and digestive tract. This is emergency alert. We want everything to be able for us to be able to fight or flight, right? That's the fight or flight response. So here is a summary of all of those hormones. So you can see what layer they're released from, how they're controlled, and what their actions are. So a lot happening in the adrenal gland. All right, so here's our pancreas. The pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So we looked at the exocrine portion of this gland in the digestive system chapter. We said the pancreatic acini, so the darker staining portions of the pancreas, are going to be the part of the pancreas that deals with digestion. It makes the pancreatic juice. We talked about, we said it had bicarbonate in it and lots of enzymes to help with digestion of all kinds of macromolecules. So that's what's going to be the exocrine part. The endocrine side of the pancreas is going to be formed by the pancreatic islets. So they are these big lighter staining areas that kind of look like islands. So the pancreatic islands or islets are going to contain 4 types of cells. They are going to have alpha cells that release glucagon and increase blood glucose. They're going to have beta cells that release insulin and increase blood glucose. They're going to have delta cells that release somatostatin and inhibit the release of glucagon and insulin and slow our digestion down. And then they're going to have pancreatic polypeptide cells that release pancreatic polypeptide. This inhibits somatostatin release and promotes digestion, increases gallbladder contraction, increases the release of those digestive enzymes by the pancreas. So again, most important are the alpha cells and the beta cells. You absolutely need to know that beta cells secrete insulin and that this decreases blood glucose levels. So, insulin is released during times of hyperglycemia. So this is after a meal when your blood sugar is high. Glucagon is released in the opposite, right? It's released during times of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. So this is your fasting state or that post-absorptive state that we talked about in the metabolism chapter. Glucagon directly stimulates insulin, and insulin inhibits glucagon. So think about why that makes sense. Again, blood sugar has to be in a normal set range. Glucagon, when released, is going to increase blood sugar. It doesn't know where the cutoff is. It just knows increase. Let's go increase the blood sugar. That's its job. That's its only job. Insulin, it's going to have to stimulate insulin release to put a cap on that upper end, right? We want to make sure we are stopping blood sugar from increasing past normal. So insulin is going to come in and say, hey, that's enough. You did your job. That's good. So when the insulin levels then get higher, they will directly inhibit that glucagon and say, okay, enough action. This blood sugar's high enough. So insulin and glucagon will kind of keep each other in balance that way. And everything's kind of regulated again by that negative feedback loop based on blood sugar, which is what you can kind of see here in this picture. Now, what else? There are other factors that do stimulate insulin and glucagon release. Growth hormone and ACTH are both going to increase insulin release. Again, with growth, we're going to need a lot of things to be in check. We're going to need to have those we're going to increase the molecules in the bloodstream to make ATP, but at the same time, we can't elevate blood sugar too high that we start causing issues with that. So growth hormone and ACTH are going to be involved with stimulating insulin release. Acetylcholine during the parasympathetic nervous system response, because that's usually the nervous system activated during that rest digest stage, right? So when you're digesting your food, that's usually a parasympathetic process. So insulin's going to be released during that to help stimulate digestion. Amino acids, arginine and leucine, again, if you have a large protein-rich meal, those are going to be able to be put into the Krebs cycle and made into ATP, right? We looked at this briefly in the metabolism chapter. So our amino acids entered the Krebs cycle and they were able to be made into ATP. So your body's also going to go, hey, we also want to make sure this pathway doesn't go in reverse and make too much blood sugar. So again, going to help keep all kind of macromolecules in check because eventually we could lead to too much glucose. It's going to be stimulated by GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide. This is released by the enteroendocrine cells of the small intestine. So we looked at this in the digestive chapter, and it's going to respond to glucose in the digestive tract. Okay, so all of that stimulates insulin release. What stimulates glucagon release? Well, low blood sugar, the sympathetic nervous system activity, right? Like exercise, your tissues are needing more energy, and an increase in amino acids after a meal with a decreased glucose level. So this is just a large kind of just protein meal. So again, you will see these signals altered based on diet because that's what's going to alter blood sugar. So here we see our summary of what the pancreas does. So our alpha cells, our beta cells, our delta cells, and these pancreatic polypeptide cells that they used to call F cells that they don't call anymore. So really the two that you want to know about are the alpha cells and the beta cells. Absolutely critical to understand the signaling of insulin and glucagon. You will have learned so much more about diabetes, so really important to get the basics down. What is the basis for controlling blood sugar normally in your patient that it does not have diabetes? Okay, now we can adapt that to a problem state of diabetes. So again, really get your normals down, especially with this one. I cannot stress enough how important blood sugar is for you to understand. All right, so now just some other kind of extra hormones. We are going to have these ovarian and testicular hormones that we are going to talk about in the reproductive chapter. So your book mentions them, so are we, but I'm not going to give you any test questions on these hormones in this chapter, on this exam. These will be on your exam with your reproductive hormones, because we are going to go into a lot more detail and explain these and how they work a lot better. All right, another minor kind of other hormone that we don't think of from one of our major endocrine glands is melatonin from our pineal gland. So the pineal gland is in the brain. It kind of sits posterior to the pituitary gland. It's a little tiny guy. And it has these cells. It has these cells called pinealocytes. Pinealocytes secrete melatonin, and melatonin is derived from the neurotransmitter serotonin. Melatonin helps with that circadian rhythm, that biological clock, so your body knows when to go into puberty and menopause and all that kind of stuff. But it also knows when to be asleep and be awake. So this is what is kind of responsible for those sleep-wake cycles. Melatonin is increased in response to darkness. So if you are in a dark area, it's going to cause you to be sleepy. So if you've ever driven at night and you're like, no, I'm fine, I'm not even tired, and you drive at night and you're like, well, I'm pretty tired, and you get a coffee, right? It's just because that darkness is kind of increasing your melatonin secretion, which is going to help promote your sleepiness. So in your eye, you have the retina. The retina is going to detect all the light that comes into your eye and deal with vision and all that jazz. It's also going to send this response that there's light entering the eyes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the pineal gland. This is going to stimulate this melatonin release in a rhythmic pattern. So this is why people get into a sleep-wake cycle, right? You know, you wake up a lot of times like 10 minutes before your alarm goes off by the end of the semester because you're very used to having to get up at that time. You know, if you've ever had to switch from day shift to night shift, that it can be hard to reverse those patterns, especially if you've worked a night shift for a really, really, really long time. It can be very hard to switch back to sleeping during the day, or sleeping at night and being awake during the day. My mom has worked a night shift for her whole life, and I don't think that she could ever go back to day shift. She will sleep through every daytime event ever. Her body is just now like set. Daytime is sleeping time, nighttime is awake time. And again, you'll see this. We can prescribe melatonin to help our patients with some sleep adjustment. Maybe they moved to a new time zone. Maybe they switched hours at work. Maybe you guys have switched clinical rotations. So I had to do a really, it wasn't an overnight rotation, but it was a super early morning rotation where I had to be in at like 3 or 4 a.m. to prep the department for the day. So getting used to waking up at 2:30 in the morning so I could get on the metro to get to the hospital by 3 a.m. was a lot for me to adjust to. So melatonin can help during these changing of sleeping patterns. And we give this a lot to people for jet lag and stuff too, switching time zones. Melatonin is over the counter. I have not seen anything that says it's harmful. I mean, obviously, don't overtake it, just like any medication. And they also say it can be kind of beneficial as an antioxidant or an anti-cancer agent. It prevents against free radical formation. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think they're working on the science behind all that. So seasonal affective disorder, which is very common in our region of the country right now. Seasonal affective disorder has very high rates in Pennsylvania, especially this time of year. So this usually happens due to an increase in melatonin production. So if you have too much melatonin, you can start to have some kind of depressive symptoms. This can be improved with light, increasing the amount of light that your patient is getting exposed to. So we can provide full light therapy, or just tell your patient on all the sunny days, make sure they get outside 10 to 15 minutes, even in the freezing cold. Just go get outside for a little bit, and that will really help. With that bright light, we can decrease the melatonin production and kind of help this seasonal affective disorder. All right. Other hormones that we've already kind of talked about or touched on, so I will not ask you about the thymic hormones on this exam. We talked about this in the immune system. We said the thymus is where all those T cells matured, and they have a lot of factors that are going to help them do that. Those factors are hormones. So thymosin, thymic humoral factor, thymic factor, and thymopoietin are all going to be involved in this development and maturation of T cells. Again, very, very detailed process. Lots of places where things can go wrong. So that's usually what you will see. Some kind of T cell deficiency disorder, something like that. Again, we are not going to go over these, but your book includes them. So now you've seen them, you know where they're at. Again, anything with thymo or thymic in it relates to the thymus. And it's really the only word that we have in the body like this for once. Normally they give us 10 words for the same thing. So at least anytime you'll see this, you'll know it involves the thymus, which is involving T cells. Okay. And another important group of minor hormones, I think of these as more self-signaling molecules, but they are hormones, and they're called eicosanoids. So eicosanoids are this big umbrella term of a large group of molecules that are all derived from this molecule called arachidonic acid. This is a 20-carbon acid that we can break down, and we can form these various eicosanoids that act as autocrine or paracrine hormones. These are very short-lived. They don't last in the blood very long because they are rapidly inactivated. So again, these are usually more local responses rather than a whole systemic response. Two categories of eicosanoids are prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Some prostaglandins that you will learn about are thromboxane, which we talked about briefly, that involves blood clotting. So this was that vascular spasm and platelet plug formation. So this is thromboxane is a prostaglandin and is going to help signal to decrease blood loss. Again, you're going to have a lot of prostaglandins, and you're going to learn them. They're important. We use these as drug targets. We give artificial ones. We block these cell signaling. They're involved in immune responses, fever, pain, reproductive processes, glandular secretions, all kinds of things. Again, just many different prostaglandins. And again, you'll learn the ones that are important for you by somebody who knows exactly which ones you need to know. You're also going to see leukotrienes. These are a really important group of eicosanoids. These stimulate chemotaxis of white blood cells, so bringing white blood cells towards infection, and mediate inflammation. So a lot of times we see leukotrienes involved in asthma and allergy responses, again, which are going to be important for you because we're going to give medications that affect these. So you will learn which leukotrienes, which prostaglandins, etc., in the eicosanoid group that you need to know. I just wanted you to have the vocabulary words and understand that our prostaglandins and leukotrienes are under the umbrella term of eicosanoids, and that they're just all derived from the same original molecule. And again, you will learn more about these based on which ones you need to know specifically. All right, so here are some other hormones that your book lists that are kind of randomly produced, I think. That's how I like to think of them. Like there's just kind of these random little endocrine cells tucked throughout the body that release hormones, and it's not really a whole gland's job, it's just a cell. And so a good example of this were those G cells that secreted gastrin in the gastric gland and pit. Remember that gastrin just stimulated digestive processes. So our gastrin and our GIP, secretin and CCK, we all talked about in the digestive system. So really good to review these, as these are definitely fair game for this exam. We are going to talk about the placental hormones when we get to the reproductive system, and we will talk about the renal hormones when we get to the kidneys. We've already talked about erythropoietin and calcitrol. Well, we briefly touched on calcitrol. We'll talk about vitamin D more in the kidneys. And then we looked at the ANP when we talked about the heart, and we talked about blood volume. And again, we'll look at this more when we look at the kidneys as well. And in adipose tissue, there's a special hormone called leptin that we currently think suppresses appetite. So they're looking at this as an appetite suppressant, but that's not the only thing it does. It increases other hormone levels that could have potential more important side effects than just appetite suppressant. So we're not going to cover leptin, but very interesting. There's a lot of papers and stuff coming out about leptin right now because, again, they're trying to use this as a drug to suppress appetite in patients who kind of have an overactive appetite. But again, we can't just decrease their appetite and then also mess with a bunch of other hormones. So more to come on this. Really, I think a really interesting hormone, but not one that will be on your test. Just because we're super unsure of all the exact facts about it. And I'm not going to test you on something that I'm like, well, we kind of think it does this. So another group of substances that your book talks about are the growth factors. So growth factors stimulate cell division. They are called mitogenic substances. So really, that's what I want you to know from this, is just what's over here. That growth factors are considered mitogenic substances, which means they stimulate cell division. Growth factors are responsible for cell growth, division, and repair. Growth factors are very important that they're regulated very highly because we don't want inappropriate growth in certain tissues. Tumors can manipulate some of these growth factors, and that's how they get uncontrolled growth. Mitogenic substances can be a lot of things. It's not just growth factors that we call mitogens. Mitogens are anything that can stimulate cell division. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. So you just want to be aware of the term mitogenic substance, because I want you, if you ever see this on anything, to be very careful with that substance, that you don't get it on you if you're trying to administer it, right? If you have something that can stimulate cell division in your patient, they might need it for some reason. It might be a chemical that you're using to clean at work or something else that is not supposed to be for your patient. But anytime you see mitogenic substance labeled on a label, that could alter your cell division and could cause cancer. So you want to be very careful with things that are called mitogenic substances. So that's kind of a hormone endocrine thing, but also just kind of a life thing. Again, you know, you've seen safety warnings on all kinds of cleaning products just in your house. In the hospital, we have a lot stronger ones. Some of them can have serious effects on your body if you don't use gloves or something when you're cleaning with them. So you always want to make sure that you're protecting yourself, wearing gloves, reading labels, making sure you are taking the safety precautions that you need to, whether you're cleaning a patient room or administering a medication. Just because it's safe for your patient to take in their condition doesn't mean that it's safe for you to be exposed to with healthy cells. Okay, so sidebar there, but I had to have at least one this lecture. So, last thing we're really going to talk about is our stress response, and then we'll look at a few endocrine disorders, and that will be it. So, our stress response, again, can be a short time stress, right? Epinephrine and norepinephrine get released in that emergency alert situation. Maybe there's a tiger standing in front of you. Maybe somebody just cut you off in traffic and you just slam your brakes on, right? That still makes you grab the seat and, oh my goodness, right? It's still a stressful event. It's just short term. So that epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be released, whether it was there was a tiger in your driveway when you went to the car this morning, or you just got cut off in traffic. We're still going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they're going to cause all of those short-term stress effects, right? You get that increased heart rate and blood pressure that we talked about, increased respiratory rate. Your pupils are going to dilate so you can look around and get all the information of, okay, what's happening? Is there another tiger? Which side of the lane can I direct my car to if somebody just stopped quickly in front of me? Can I swerve to the right or left to make sure that I don't hit someone? that split second decision. All of these things are happening so you can make that decision, and you're not even ever aware of it usually. Again, a lot of times that increases your body temperature. You start to sweat. Your palms will at least get sweaty on the steering wheel. So again, that's all kind of a short-lived fight or flight response based on the epinephrine and norepinephrine. You've been in those situations, and a couple minutes down the road, you listen to a song or two, right? You relax a little bit, and all of that goes away, and you go about your day like nothing happened. So that's usually our short-term response. Our long-term stress response, so when you have chronic stress over a long time, so kids that grow up in a stressful household, you have a job that you have to work 12 hours a day at that you hate or is extremely stressful. There's a lot of different things, a lot of different reasons that we can have long-term stress in our life. Maybe you're in school and it really stresses you out. If you are under long-term stress, you're going to start to release cortisol at higher levels, and you will start to see all of these responses. You will start to see all kinds of issues with your nutrients, your inflammatory responses, your infection responses, right? That is immune responses. This long-term elevated stressful life can lead to cortisol being overly produced and lots of long-term effects. So we want to make sure that we are counseling our patients and taking care of ourselves, that we are doing something that we enjoy, and we are decreasing our stress levels as much as possible, right? Some stress in life is normal, right? Nothing is, easy peasy all day long, right? A little bit of stress is okay. Cortisol is normal. It's good to be elevated. We have it when we need it. We don't want you to be stressed out 24/7, 365 for years, right? Or even a year. So you're going to want to help your patients with this and make sure you're taking care of yourself and promote this with your coworkers, right? Stress is physiologically bad for the body. We know that. We know what it does physiologically. We can't just say, oh, you're just stressed out. No, you're going to have long-term health effects if you're stressed out for too long. So make sure that we are not having this cortisol be over-released due to increased stress. Because eventually, these cells are going to get exhausted, just like you probably will. Everything's not going to function properly, right? You're not going to be able to think straight. Your patient's going to start to have depressive symptoms. They're going to be sick all the time because their immune system isn't working. They're going to be malnourished because they're not getting the nutrients that they need. And they're just going to feel generally really terrible. We can also start to have a lot of serious disease processes now occur because our normal cells just are not functioning. And so many body systems are being affected at one time. So long-term stress, really not good. Make sure that we are, that you understand that this is a physiological issue, right? That is not just, oh, you can pull through, you can tough it out. No, you're actually going to do physiological harm to your body. So take time to discuss this with your patients and take time and take care of yourself. All right, now the fun stuff. How is this going to present to you in the hospital? What are you going to see? Well, we already talked about increased and decreased growth hormone. Decreased growth hormone, pituitary dwarfism, right? We'll see decreased growth hormone. All body statures, like all body structures, will be smaller. If we have increased growth hormone in kiddos, we see giantism. And increased growth hormone in adults, we see that acromegalia with the large bones. So, if we have decreased thyroid hormones, decreased thyroid hormones during fetal development, we will get congenital hypothyroidism. This is where we'll see those developmental delays, intellectual disability, and short stature. If we have decreased thyroid hormone in grown-ups, do we have that on the next slide? Yes, okay. We'll get hypothyroidism. So we'll look at that in just a second. We can get something called a goiter. That is an enlarged thyroid gland due to iodine deficiency. So if your patient lives somewhere where they don't have a lot of iodine in their diet, or their iodine is deficient because they don't eat things with iodine in the US, they can end up with a large lump on their neck. That's their thyroid gland enlarging to try to overcome this deficiency. And it can get really big. So we call this a goiter. Again, not very common in the US, but other parts of the world where they don't eat a lot of salt or iodine in their diet, you'll see goiter. Graves' disease, very common cause of hyperthyroidism. You will see this in the hospital in the US for sure. On your clinical rotations, you will absolutely see Graves' disease. I know multiple people who have had it just like that I know personally. just very common. For some reason, your body produces antibodies that look like TSH. So they are antibodies to the TSH receptor. So these antibodies bind the TSH receptor and like improperly overactivate it. So we make way too much T3 and T4, and we end up with this severe form of hyperthyroidism. One of the big giveaways of this disorder is called exophthalmos. This is where your patient's eyes are going to kind of protrude from their head. They look like their eyes are popping out. So Google exophthalmos if you'd like to see that. It's very interesting and usually a very good giveaway of what's going on. So, what are our symptoms of hyper and hypothyroidism? Oh, I can't make that fit in the box. That's interesting. So, hyperthyroidism. So, you're going to have increased thyroid hormone. So, you're going to have increased metabolic rate. So, let's think about what that would do. If we increased your metabolism, what's that going to do? Well, it's going to increase your heart rate. You're going to start to have heart palpitations. Your patient's going to feel their heart beating out of their chest is what they'll tell you. I feel like my heart's pounding. They're going to be agitated. They're going to, a lot of times, tell you, I'm getting in arguments at work. I'm getting in arguments with my friends. Or I'm getting in arguments at home. Everything annoys me. Everything annoys me. I'm normally not an agitated person, but I see a sock on the floor and I lose my mind. I can't sleep at night. I'm losing weight and I'm not trying, right? They'll tell you I'm eating dinner, but I'm losing weight. Maybe you'll notice it when you're looking at their weights from their chart. You're going, wow, they were a normal weight for 10 years. And like same weight, not normal, like same weight for 10 years. And then boom, all of a sudden now we have this crazy weight loss and they're telling you, no, I'm not doing anything different. They'll be sweating a lot. They'll tell you I'm hot all the time. A lot of times it's our thyroid patients are female. The majority of them are. So a lot of times they'll come and be like, am I going through menopause early? Because you'll see this in late 20s, 30s kind of range of females. So a lot of times they'll think there's something else hormonal going on. They're hyperactive, can't sit still. They'll tell you, I can't sit still for anything. And they'll be up pacing your waiting room. I'm telling you, paint yourself a picture of this lady. She's in one of those swishy pants tracksuits. You gave her a clipboard of paperwork to fill out. She can't fill it out. She can't sit still to read the questions. She's got it tucked under her arm. She's yelling at somebody on her cell phone, pacing back and forth in your waiting room, right? And she's red-faced, she's sweating, she looks like she just got done at the gym and she just got in the shower and came to your office this morning. And so you will see her, even before you bring her back into the room, you're going to be taking mental notes to chart. Okay, yep, she's agitated. Yep, she's, overactive. All of these things, start to observe all of these actions of people. What are your patients doing in the waiting room? How are they acting, right? Are they talking a mile a minute to the person they're sitting next to? Are they annoyed at everything? Can she fill out her paperwork? Can she even sit down and read the questions? So, really good way to think about what the thyroid gland does is by looking at these kind of abnormals, because it's a really good kind of reminder of what the normals are. So, hypothyroidism is going to be the exact opposite of this. So, this is your decreased T3 and T4. So, now your metabolism is slowed way down. And so, your patient is tired all the time. They're like, sliding their feet on the floor trying to follow you back to the room, right? Like it's an effort for them to carry their purse and their coat back the hallway. They're tired. Their skin looks real dry. Their hair's going to look brittle. So you'll notice if you've seen Mrs. Jones before and now she comes in and she has hypothyroidism, maybe she looks a little different today. Maybe she looks a little bit more tired. Her skin looks a little bit more dry. Her hair's not done up as nice as she usually has it because it's starting to break off. She just seems real tired, real down. Maybe she's coming in every other time you see her and she's super happy and up, talking to everybody in the office. This morning she barely said hello. You test her reflexes. Her reflexes are decreased. Her heart rate's decreased. She's telling you she's short of breath going up the stairs now. And she's just like, I don't know what's wrong. I'm just so tired. I don't feel like getting out of bed. I don't want to do anything. You kind of feel like Eeyore. She's like, yeah, I could just sit here all day. I'm fine with it. No, but I don't really have anything to say today. They're not really making small talk with you. Again, if this is abnormal for your patient, it can be their thyroid. Again, they're going to be the complete opposite of hyperthyroid lady. So picture these people in your head, and it'll help you remember what your thyroid does. All right, so what about our cortisone? So Cushing's syndrome is due to increased cortisol levels. You're going to see hypertension, weight gain. We call this moon face. You can Google it. It's a big round face. You'll see abdominal striae, which are these very bright red stretch marks that go up the abdomen. You're going to see hyperglycemia, and you're going to see increased infection because they have immune system suppression. So you will see a lot of these same symptoms when you give your patients steroids. So if your patient is on oral steroids, these are going to be a lot of the symptoms that you're going to warn them about. If they have this overactive naturally because of their own cortisol, they will come in and present like this. And you'll say, oh, okay, this looks like a hormone problem. So that's our Cushing's syndrome. Addison's disease is the deficiency of cortisol and also aldosterone. So you're going to have hypotension and increased potassium, hyperkalemia. So you see a lot of heart symptoms with this, right? We know potassium is responsible for that repolarization phase. This can be chronic due to adrenal destruction by an autoimmune disease or tuberculosis. So you'll see this a lot in your homeless patients in the U.S. And then our type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So these are absolutely crucial for you guys to learn. I'm not going to test you about them, but you're going to learn these in nursing in detail. So if you can go in with a good, picture of what is happening, what the problem is, and let them add to it, you'll be a lot better off because you'll have a good basis of what we're talking about. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes both involve the beta cells of the pancreas. Neither one of them can produce enough insulin to meet the patient's needs. Type 1 happens in kiddos. We have autoimmune destruction in these beta cells. So these beta cells get destroyed. They are completely not there. They are not active. They are not ever coming back. They're not being able to be turned back on. They do not exist anymore. We can't make insulin in this kid. I say kid because that's usually when this presents. We usually see this in 4 to 6, 4 to 7 year olds, somewhere in there. Again, our symptoms of diabetes are going to be polydipsia, which means increased thirst, polyphagia, which means increased hunger, and polyuria, which is increased urination. Again, you can see this in kids who are just growing, right? But a lot of times mom will start to really notice this. Though usually it's the thirst. A lot of times kids are just hungry, right? If you've been around kids, they could eat nonstop. But a lot of times kids will start asking for water. They'll say they're thirsty. If you've ever seen kids, been around kids, they don't really ask for water that much. And so mom will usually be like, oh, that's weird. But, maybe it was a hot day or something. But it'll be continual. They'll also be going to the bathroom all the time. So kids that didn't wet the bed might start to wet the bed. Or everywhere they go, they'll start to say, I have to pee. Right? So we'll start to see that in these kiddos. Type 2 diabetes is, again, going to be this beta cell not working or being able to secrete enough insulin, but it's usually because it is overworked. It's tired. It can't do it anymore. Your patient's blood sugar has been so elevated for so long that the pancreas cannot take it. It cannot secrete enough insulin to keep that blood sugar within normal limits. We have very high sugar diets in the United States, and so that's why we really see a lot of increased incidence of type 2 diabetes, because patients' blood sugar will just be so far above normal all day long that all their pancreas is doing is trying to pump out insulin to try to keep it in that normal limit. It just can't. It gets too tired, and those cells get gassed out. They can't do it anymore. So these are the people that we can give medications to hopefully try to decrease their blood glucose other ways. We can try to give them medicine to help turn these cells back on. And we can monitor their glucose and alter it that way. And our type 1 diabetic kids, we have to give insulin replacement. So these are the kids who get insulin injections or have insulin pumps. So again, just kind of a brief overview of diabetes. I'm not going to quiz you about any of the endocrine disorders. So everything before that is fair game for your test. And that is everything that we have for the endocrine system.